It was one of those crisp mornings in Maplewood, the kind where the air feels fresh and everything seems calm. The sun had just begun to peek over the horizon, casting soft golden rays across the sleepy little town. At Joe's Diner, the day was already underway. The faint smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of sizzling bacon wafted through the air, drawing in customers who craved comfort food and a cozy atmosphere. Joe's Diner wasn't anything fancy, just your typical roadside joint, with checkered floors, vinyl booths that squeaked when you slid into them, and walls adorned with old black and white photos of the town from decades past. But it didn't need to be fancy. For years it had been the heart of Maplewood, a place where people came not just for pancakes and eggs, but for conversation, laughter, and a sense of belonging. At a corner booth near the window sat an elderly couple, their presence as familiar as the faded menu hanging above the counter. Margaret and Harold Thompson were fixtures at the diner, regulars who showed up every Tuesday morning without fail. They'd been doing this routine for more than 20 years now, ever since they retired from teaching. To most folks, they were simply the Thompsons, a sweet pair whose kindness and gentle humor made everyone feel welcome. That morning, like any other, they settled into their usual spot. Margaret adjusted her glasses while Harold unfolded the local newspaper, squinting slightly as he scanned the headlines. Between sips of hot coffee, they chatted about their grandchildren, their garden, and how the weather seemed to be changing faster these days. It was all so ordinary, so peaceful a snapshot of life many would envy, but sometimes even the quietest moments can take unexpected turns. As the Thompsons enjoyed their breakfast, two men entered the diner. At first glance, they looked like regular customers' average height, dressed casually in jeans and jackets. But something about them felt different. Their eyes darted around the room, scanning faces and tables before finally landing on the Thompsons. Booth. Detective Lewis and Officer Ramirez weren't there for coffee or pie. They were cops working undercover, following up on a vague tip-off that had landed on their desks earlier that week. Someone had claimed that stolen goods were being passed around by seniors in the area, and the trail led to none other than Margaret and Harold. There was no hard evidence, only whispers, but that didn't stop the detectives from deciding to act. As they approached the Thompsons' table, the mood shifted almost imperceptibly. Margaret glanced up from stirring her tea, her brow furrowing in confusion. Harold lowered his newspaper, his expression mirroring hers. "Can we help you?" he asked politely, though there was a hint of unease in his voice. The taller of the two men slid into the booth opposite them without waiting for an invitation. He pulled out a badge and flashed it briefly, letting it catch the light before tucking it away again. "We're with the police," he said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Margaret blinked, startled. "Police? What's this about?" she asked, gripping the edge of the table instinctively. Harold leaned back slightly, adjusting his glasses as if trying to process what was happening. "We've received reports," and the man continued, leaning forward with an intensity that made both Margaret and Harold uncomfortable, "that you've been involved in some questionable activities lately." Harold frowned deeply. "Questionable activities? I don't understand. We're just having breakfast." His wife nodded vigorously beside him. "Yes, we come here every week. Ask anyone, they'll tell you we haven't done anything wrong." The second officer, standing nearby with his arms crossed, remained silent but kept a watchful eye on the couple. His stance radiated authority, making it clear that he wasn't there to offer reassurance. Meanwhile, the first officer pressed on, undeterred by their protests. "Look, we're not accusing you outright," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But we do need to verify some information. Can you show us some ID? Maybe explain a bit about your recent financial transactions?" Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her purse. She fumbled with its contents, pulling out her driver's license and handing it over reluctantly. Harold did the same, though his movements were slower, deliberate. He tried to keep his voice steady as he spoke. "Listen, my wife and I are retired teachers. We live modestly, pay our taxes, and spend our days gardening and visiting family. You won't find anything suspicious because there's nothing to find. Despite their insistence, the officers weren't satisfied. If anything, their skepticism only deepened. The tension in the diner grew palpable, spreading like ripples in a pond. Other patrons began to notice the exchange, their conversations trailing off as they glanced curiously or nervously at the unfolding scene. A young waitress named Jenny, balancing a tray of plates, hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. Her voice was soft but firm as she addressed the taller officer. "Sir, maybe this isn't the best place for this," she suggested cautiously. "They're good people. I've known them for years." Her words hung in the air, momentarily breaking the standoff. But the damage had already been done. The Thompsons felt cornered, embarrassed, and bewildered. How could such a mundane morning turn into this? And why were these strangers targeting them? Unbeknownst to everyone in the diner, including the officers themselves, the situation was about to escalate further. Far beyond the reach of Maplewood, someone else was listening intently to a phone call that would change everything. The tension in the diner thickened with every passing second. The Thompsons sat frozen, their faces pale and eyes wide with confusion. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her purse tightly against her chest, while Harold adjusted his glasses again and again, a nervous habit he'd had for years. Neither of them could understand why these two men were accusing them of something so absurd: stolen goods, questionable activities. It sounded like something out of a movie, not their quiet, predictable lives. Detective Lewis leaned further across the table, his elbows resting on the Formica surface. His voice was sharp, almost cutting through the air. "Look," he said, narrowing his eyes at the couple, "we're just doing our job here. We've got information, and we need answers. That's all." Harold cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. He wasn't used to confrontation, let alone being accused of something he couldn't even comprehend. "But what kind of information?" he asked, his voice wavering slightly. "Who told you this about us?" "Because whoever it is, they're wrong." Margaret nodded quickly beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We've lived in this town for 40 years, she exclaimed, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Everyone knows us. Ask anyone, they'll tell you we're honest people." Officer Ramirez, who had been standing silently near the booth with his arms crossed, finally spoke up. "It's not about what people think," he said flatly, his tone devoid of warmth. "It's about facts. And right now, the facts point to you too?" The words hit like a punch to the gut. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and Harold reached over to pat her hand gently, trying to comfort her. But inside, he felt a storm brewing, a mix of anger, frustration, and helplessness. How could they prove their innocence when they didn't even know what they were being accused of? Other diners began to notice the escalating situation. Conversations died down, forks paused midair, and heads turned toward the booth where the Thompsons sat under intense scrutiny. Some customers exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to intervene or mind their own business. A few whispered among themselves, speculating about what might be going on. One older man sitting at the counter muttered under his breath, "This doesn't seem right." Jenny, the young waitress who had already tried to step in once, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She hovered nearby, pretending to refill coffee cups at neighboring tables but keeping a close eye on the unfolding drama. When she saw Margaret's tears, her heart sank. These weren't criminals. They were regulars, sweet people who always left a generous tip and remembered her name. Whatever was happening, it didn't sit well with her. Detective Lewis pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open, jotting down notes as he continued questioning the couple. "So, explain this to me," he said, tapping his pen against the page. "You say you're retired teachers. What did you teach?" "Where?" Harold hesitated for a moment, thrown off by the sudden shift in focus. I taught history," he stammered. "At Maplewood High School for 32 years. You?" the detective asked, turning to Margaret. "I taught English literature," she replied softly, wiping away a stray tear. "Same school, same number of years?" Lewis scribbled something in his notebook, then glanced up at them. And after retirement? What have you been doing since then? Harold blinked, taken aback by the question. Well, gardening mostly, he said, and spending time with our grandchildren. We volunteer at the library sometimes, too. Nothing exciting, really. Nothing suspicious either, Margaret added, her voice stronger now. She straightened her back, determination flickering in her eyes. If you're looking for troublemakers, you're wasting your time with us. For a brief moment, Detective? Lewis seemed to hesitate. There was something genuine about the way the couple spoke, something earnest and unguarded, but he shook it off, reminding himself that appearances could be deceiving. People didn't always look like criminals even when they were. Officer Ramirez shifted his weight from one foot to the other, scanning the room again. The growing attention from other patrons made him uneasy. He leaned closer to his partner and muttered, "Maybe we should take this outside." Too many eyes, Lewis nodded curtly, then turned back to the Thompsons. "All right, here's what's going to happen," he announced, his tone authoritative. "We'll finish this discussion elsewhere. You can come quietly, or—" He didn't get to finish his sentence. Before he could say another word, the diner door swung open with a loud creak, drawing everyone's attention. Standing in the doorway was a tall figure silhouetted by the bright sunlight streaming in behind him. For a split second, no one moved. Then, as the figure stepped forward, revealing himself fully, murmurs rippled through the room. It was a Marina man in full uniform, his posture ramrod straight and his expression unreadable. His presence commanded immediate respect, and every pair of eyes followed him as he strode purposefully toward the Thompsons' booth. As he approached, Margaret's face lit up with recognition, and Harold visibly relaxed, relief washing over his features. The Marine stopped beside the table and looked down at his parents, his gaze softening for a moment. "Mom, Dad," he said firmly but gently, "are you okay?" Margaret nodded, clutching her son's arm as if to reassure herself he was real. Yes, we're fine," she managed to say, though her voice still quivered. Harold patted his son's hand, gratitude shining in his eyes. Then, without missing a beat, the Marine turned his attention to the officers. His jaw tightened ever so slightly as he addressed them. "What exactly is going on here?" he asked. His tone calm but laced with authority. Detective Lewis faltered, caught off guard by the unexpected arrival. He glanced at the Marine's uniform, the insignias, the medals, and suddenly realized they were dealing with someone far more formidable than they'd anticipated. Officer Ramirez shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly unsettled by the turn of events. "We're conducting an investigation," Lewis replied, attempting to sound confident. "There's been a report involving these individuals." The Marine raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "A report based on what?" he asked pointedly. "Do you have evidence? Or are you just harassing my parents because someone decided to spread rumors?" His words hung heavy in the air, echoing off the diner walls. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Every patron watched intently, sensing that the tide was turning. Even Jenny, the waitress, felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this stranger in uniform would be the one to set things right. Detective Lewis opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Harold chimed in. "Son," he said, addressing the Marine, "they won't tell us anything. Specific, just accusations, no proof, nothing solid." The Marine nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Then, turning back to the officers, he spoke again, his voice firm and unwavering. "Let me make one thing clear," he said. "My parents are good people. If you want to accuse them of something, you'd better come prepared with actual evidence, not baseless hearsay." The detectives exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they were on shaky ground. They had walked into the diner expecting an easy interrogation, but instead, they found themselves facing a force they hadn't anticipated, a family united, backed by integrity and truth. As the standoff continued, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. What had started as fear and uncertainty began to transform into something else: solidarity. The patrons, once mere observers, now felt emboldened. One by one, voices joined the chorus, vouching for the Thompsons and challenging the officers' motives. And somewhere in the background, Jenny quietly slipped her phone from her apron pocket, hitting record. The Marines' arrival had changed everything. The diner, which just moments ago felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode, now seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was fixed on the man in uniform, his presence radiating strength and calm. Even the officers who had been so confident in their approach appeared uneasy, shifting their weight from one foot to the other as if unsure of what to do next. "Let me make one thing clear," the Marine repeated, his voice steady but firm. "My parents are good people. If you want to accuse them of something, you'd better come prepared with actual evidence, not baseless hearsay." Detective Lewis cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. He glanced at his partner, Officer Ramirez, then back at the Marine. "We're not accusing them outright," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "We're following up on credible information, that's all." The Marine raised an eyebrow. "Credible information?" He echoed, skepticism dripping from his words. "From who? An anonymous tip? A rumor someone overheard at the grocery store?" Lewis hesitated, caught between wanting to defend his actions and knowing how flimsy their case really was. "It's part of our job to investigate leads," he replied defensively. "We can't ignore potential crimes, no matter where they come from." The Marine didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to his parents, placing a reassuring hand on each of their shoulders. "Are you two all right?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. Margaret nodded, clutching her son's arm tightly, while Harold gave a small, grateful smile, though they were still shaken. Having their son there made them feel safer, stronger. When the Marine turned back to face the officers, his expression hardened again. "You say you're investigating," he said, taking a step closer to the booth, "but I don't see any warrants, no proof. Just accusations thrown around like it's nothing. Do you realize how humiliating this is for them?" Detective Lewis opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. For the first time since entering the diner, he seemed unsure of what to say. The Marine wasn't yelling or making threats, he was simply stating facts, his tone measured yet unyielding. It was clear that this wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, attempting to diffuse the tension. "Look, we're just doing our jobs," he said, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. Their badges gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but even that symbol of authority seemed diminished in the face of the Marine's quiet resolve. "That may be true," the Marine replied, his gaze locking onto Ramirez. "But there's a difference between doing your job and harassing innocent people. And from where I'm standing, this looks a lot like harassment." The room fell silent once more, the weight of his words sinking in. Other diners exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. One older woman sitting at the counter leaned over to her companion and whispered, "He's right. This doesn't feel right at all." Jenny, the young waitress, had been quietly recording the scene on her phone. She kept her movements subtle, pretending to tidy up nearby tables while keeping the camera trained on the unfolding drama. Her heart raced as she realized the significance of what was happening. This wasn't just about the Thompsons anymore, it was about standing up against injustice, about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Detective Lewis tried one last time to salvage the situation. "Listen," he said, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "If there's been a misunderstanding, we'll get to the bottom of it, but we need cooperation. That's all we're asking for." The Marine crossed his arms over his chest, his stance unwavering. "Cooperation requires trust," he said. "And right now, you haven't given my parents or anyone else in this room any reason to trust you." Harold chimed in, his voice steadier than before. "Son's right," he said, addressing the officers directly. "You've treated us like criminals without giving us a chance to explain ourselves." "We've done nothing wrong." Margaret nodded, vigorously beside him. "Nothing," she added, her voice trembling with emotion. "We've lived here for decades. Ask anyone, they'll tell you we're honest, hard-working people." At that moment, another voice joined the conversation. It was Joe, the diner owner, who had been quietly observing from behind the counter. He stepped forward now, his apron dusted with flour, his expression stern. "These folks are telling the truth," he said, pointing to the Thompsons. "I've known them for years. They wouldn't hurt a fly." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Other customers began speaking up, sharing stories about the Thompsons' kindness and generosity. One man recalled how Margaret had helped tutor his daughter in English literature. A woman remembered Harold organizing a fundraiser for the local library after budget cuts threatened to shut it down. Bit by bit, the narrative shifted from suspicion to solidarity, from accusation to affirmation. Detective Lewis looked around the room, visibly uncomfortable. The tide had turned against him and his partner, and there was no denying it. What had started as a routine investigation was spiraling out of control, turning into something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. Officer Ramirez muttered something under his breath, nudging his partner urgently. "We should wrap this up," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the growing crowd of supporters. "This isn't going well." Lewis hesitated for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. Turning back to the Thompsons, he forced a tight smile. "All right," he said, his tone clipped. "We'll look into this further and get back to you. In the meantime, thank you for your cooperation." The Marine wasn't satisfied. "You'll hear from us soon," he said, his voice low but commanding. "And if this happens again, know that we won't hesitate to take legal action." The officers exchanged quick glances, then hastily gathered their things and headed for the door. As they exited the diner, the room erupted into applause. Customers clapped and cheered, celebrating not just the departure of the detectives, but also the triumph of truth over suspicion. Jenny lowered her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she realized the magnitude of what she'd captured. She approached the Marine cautiously, holding out the device. "I recorded everything," she said timidly, "just in case you need it." The Marine smiled at her, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You did the right thing." As the adrenaline slowly faded, the Thompsons sat back in their booth, their faces flushed with a mix of relief and disbelief. Margaret wiped away a tear, her lips curving into a watery smile. Harold reached across the table to squeeze her hand, his own grip firmer now. They had survived the ordeal, thanks in large part to their son's timely intervention. The Marine slid into the booth beside them, his demeanor softening as he wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he said quietly. "But I promise you, this isn't over. We'll make sure they can't treat anyone else like this." Margaret shook her head, leaning into her son's embrace. "You came when it mattered most," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's what counts." Harold nodded in agreement, pride swelling in his chest. "We raised you right," he said, patting his son's knee. "And today you showed us exactly why we're so proud of you." Around them, the diner buzzed with renewed energy. Strangers introduced themselves to the Thompsons, offering words of support and admiration. Joe brought over a fresh pot of coffee, insisting they stay as long as they wanted. For the first time that morning, the atmosphere felt warm and welcoming again, but the Marine knew this was only the beginning. While the immediate threat had passed, there were still questions that needed answers and accountability that needed to be addressed. As he sat with his parents, listening to the hum of conversation and laughter around them, he made a silent vow. Whoever had targeted his family would regret it. Justice might take time, but it always came knocking eventually. The diner buzzed with energy as the Marine sat with his parents, their booth now surrounded by well-wishers. Strangers patted Harold on the back, telling him how proud they were of his son. Margaret smiled through tears, her hands clasped tightly, around a fresh cup of coffee that Joe had insisted she take, on the house, he'd said with a wink. It was clear that the community had rallied behind the Thompsons, but the Marine knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. As the initial excitement began to settle, the Marine leaned forward in the booth, his expression thoughtful. He turned to Jenny, who still held her phone with the recording of the confrontation. "You did the right thing," he said again, his voice calm but serious. "But I need you to send me that video. We're going to need it." Jenny nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing with pride at being trusted with such an important task. She handed over her phone so the Marine could transfer the file, explaining softly, "I started recording when things got heated. I didn't know if it would help, but I just felt like someone should." "You were brave," the Marine replied, giving her a small smile. "And you might have just saved us a lot of trouble." With the video secured, the Marine turned his attention back to his parents. "Mom, Dad," he said gently, "we need to talk about what comes next. Those officers won't admit they were wrong unless we push them. But don't worry, I'm not letting this go." Harold sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I never imagined something like this could happen," he admitted, shaking his head. "It's like waking up in some strange nightmare." Margaret reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "We'll get through it," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "We have each other, and we have our boy here. That's all that matters." The Marine nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. He pulled out his own phone and dialed a number from memory. After a few rings, a deep voice answered on the other end. "Sir, it's me," the Marine said respectfully. "I need your advice and maybe some legal assistance." The person on the other line was his commanding officer, a man known for both his integrity and his influence. Within minutes, the Marine had explained the situation, laying out the details clearly and concisely. By the time he hung up, there was a new sense of purpose in his eyes. "Help is coming," he told his parents. "The base has lawyers who specialize in cases like this. They'll guide us every step of the way." Word spread quickly outside. The diner, too. Someone had posted about the incident on social media, and within hours, the story went viral. People across Maplewood, and even beyond, were talking about the elderly couple targeted by overzealous cops and defended by their Marine son. The video Jenny recorded became a key piece of evidence, circulating online and drawing outrage from viewers who couldn't believe what they were seeing. By late afternoon, local news crews had arrived at Joe's Diner, setting up cameras and microphones near the entrance. Reporters interviewed customers, many of whom spoke passionately about the Thompsons' character. One woman, a retired librarian, recounted how Margaret had organized book drives for underprivileged kids. A man who owned a hardware store down the street praised Harold for volunteering his time to teach woodworking classes at the community center. Each story painted a picture of two people who gave endlessly to their community, not criminals or suspects, inside the diner. The Marine kept a protective arm around his mother while fielding questions from reporters. His uniform drew immediate respect, and his measured responses only added to the admiration. When asked why he intervened, he simply said, "Because they're my parents, and no one deserves to be treated the way they were today. Justice isn't just about catching bad guys, it's about protecting good people too." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with everyone watching. Online comments flooded in, praising the Marine for standing up for his family and calling for accountability from the police department. Hashtags like #StandWithTheThompsons and #JusticeForGoodPeople trended locally, sparking debates about police conduct and the importance of treating citizens with dignity. Meanwhile, the chief of police found himself inundated with calls and emails demanding answers. At first, he tried to downplay the incident, issuing a vague statement about ongoing investigations. But as public pressure mounted, he had no choice but to take action. An internal review was launched to examine the behavior of Detective Lewis and Officer Ramirez, and the anonymous tip that led them to target the Thompsons was traced back to its source. What they discovered shocked everyone. The tip had come from a disgruntled neighbor with a long-standing grudge against the Thompsons. Years earlier, Harold had reported the man for illegal dumping on their property, resulting in a hefty fine. Out of spite, the neighbor fabricated the story about stolen goods, hoping to cause trouble for the couple. When confronted, the man admitted everything, claiming he didn't think it would go this far. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Many felt anger not just at the neighbor for lying, but at the detectives for acting without proper evidence. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Evidence matters and protect the innocent." Local Leaders joined the outcry, urging reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. Back at the diner, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as possible. The Thompsons continued their weekly visits, though they now attracted more attention than ever. Customers greeted them warmly, often stopping by their booth to shake Harold's hand or hug Margaret. Even strangers passing through town stopped in, curious to meet the couple whose story had inspired so many. Joe decided to honor the family in a special way. Above the Thompsons' favorite booth, he hung a framed photograph of the Marine Inn, his uniform standing beside his parents. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Courage runs in the family." Every time the Thompsons walked into the diner, they paused to look at it, their hearts swelling with gratitude for the Marine. The experience reinforced his belief in standing up for what's right. Though he lived miles away at his base, he made it a point to visit his parents more often, knowing how much they meant to him and how much he meant to them. During one of these visits, Harold looked at his son and said, "You didn't just defend us that day. You reminded everyone that good people deserve to be protected." The Marine smiled, resting a hand on his father's shoulder. "That's what families do," he replied. "We stick together, always." As weeks turned into months, the Thompsons' ordeal faded from the headlines, but its impact lingered. The diner remained a symbol of resilience and unity, a place where people came not just for food, but for connection. And for the Marine, the lesson was clear. Justice may take time, but when good people stand together, it always prevails. The weeks that followed the diner incident brought a mix of emotions for the Thompsons and their community. Life in Maplewood slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the ripple effects of that morning lingered long after the news cameras packed up and moved on. For Margaret and Harold, the experience had been both harrowing and transformative. They were no longer just the quiet retired teachers who frequented Joe's diner. They had become symbols of resilience, proof that ordinary people could stand tall when faced with injustice. Every Tuesday, the couple continued their tradition of visiting the diner, sitting in their favorite booth beneath the framed photograph of their son in uniform. It wasn't unusual now for strangers to approach them, offering kind words or sharing stories of how their courage had inspired others. One elderly woman recounted how she'd finally confronted her noisy neighbor about late-night parties after hearing the Thompsons' story. "If you two can face down cops, I figured I could at least knock on a door," she joked. Though her tone carried genuine admiration, Margaret often found herself tearing up during these moments, not out of sadness, but gratitude. She would squeeze Harold's hand under the table as they listened to these heartfelt exchanges, marveling at how something so painful had turned into something so meaningful. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said one morning, stirring cream into her coffee. "All we wanted was a quiet breakfast, and suddenly this," Harold chuckled softly, adjusting his glasses. "Life has a funny way of surprising us," he replied. "But if this is the surprise we got, I'll take it." Their son visited whenever his schedule allowed, always making time for family dinners and long walks around the neighborhood. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, forged not just by love but by the shared experience of standing together against adversity. During one of these visits, the Marine sat with his parents on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "people keep calling me a hero, but the real heroes are you two." Margaret shook her head, her eyes shining. "No, sweetheart. You're the one who stepped in when we needed you most. We couldn't have done it without you." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. The truth was, none of them could have faced the ordeal alone. It took a family united, parents defending their dignity, a son stepping up to protect them, and a community rallying behind them to turn what could have been a tragedy into a triumph. At the police department, accountability came swiftly. The internal investigation revealed glaring flaws in the detectives' handling of the case, from relying on an anonymous tip without verifying it to treating the Thompsons as suspects without probable cause. Both Detective Lewis and Officer Ramirez were suspended pending further review, and the chief of police issued a formal apology to the Thompsons during a press conference. Standing before reporters, he admitted, "We failed not only Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, but also the trust our community places in us. This will not happen again." While some residents appreciated the gesture, others remained skeptical, calling for broader reforms within the department. Community meetings were held to discuss ways to improve transparency and build better relationships between law enforcement and citizens. The Thompsons attended several of these gatherings, speaking candidly about their experience and urging everyone to focus on solutions rather than blame. "We don't want anyone else to feel the way we did," Margaret told the crowd at one meeting. "Let's work together to make sure this never happens again." The disgruntled neighbor who fabricated the false tip faced legal consequences as well. Though his actions stemmed from pettiness rather than malice, the damage he caused was undeniable. He was fined and ordered to perform community service, a punishment that many felt fit the crime. More importantly, his behavior served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of spreading lies, even seemingly harmless ones, for Joe's Diner. Business boomed in the aftermath of the incident. Locals flocked to support the establishment where the Thompsons' story unfolded, eager to sit in the same booth or sip coffee from the same mugs. Joe embraced the newfound attention, using it as an opportunity to give back to the community. He organized fundraisers for local charities and hosted events to celebrate unsung heroes in Maplewell: teachers, nurses, volunteers, and others who quietly made a difference every day. Above the Thompsons' booth, the plaque reading "Courage Runs in the Family" became a focal point for visitors. School groups touring the diner often stopped to hear the story behind it, leaving inspired by the idea that even in tough times, ordinary people could do extraordinary things. Teachers used the Thompsons' example to teach lessons about integrity, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. As months passed, the Marine returned to his duties at the base, carrying with him the lessons he'd learned. In Maplewood, his commanding officer commended him not just for his bravery overseas, but for his leadership closer to home. "You reminded us all why we serve," the officer said during a briefing. "To protect those who deserve protection and to remind them they're never alone." Back in Maplewood, life moved forward, but the memory of that morning at the diner remained etched in the town's collective consciousness. It was a reminder that justice isn't always delivered in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes quietly, through the courage of good people refusing to back down. And it was a testament to the enduring strength of family, a bond that could weather storms, overcome challenges, and emerge stronger on the other side. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled outside the diner windows, Margaret leaned over to Harold with a smile. "Do you think we'll ever stop coming here?" she asked playfully. Harold raised an eyebrow, pretending to consider the question. "Only if they run out of pie," he quipped, earning a laugh from both his wife and the waitress who happened to overhear. In that moment, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and the comforting hum of conversation, the Thompsons knew they had everything they needed. They weren't just survivors of an unjust accusation, they were victors, their story a beacon of hope for anyone who dared to believe in fairness, truth, and the unbreakable ties of family. And as the sun streamed through the blinds, casting familiar patterns across the checkered floor, the diner felt exactly as it always had, a place where life happened, where stories began, and where courage ran deep in the family, in the community, and in the hearts of everyone lucky enough to call Maplewood home.